Good afternoon. Welcome to our monthly MTAC lecture. I would like to introduce Dr. David Callaway and his topic on the triage of the dynamic mass casualty incidents. I think this is going to be a very interesting lecture. It's obviously unfortunate that we have to prepare for these. I think the MTAC itself has a pretty long history with this. Especially after the grant support that we got after 9/11 through the ASPR grants and the development of the warehouse over by the airport with a lot of disaster preparedness and equipment set out through the entire MTAC region in our preparedness through the Med-1, which a number in this audience participated in the original deployment down in Waveland, Mississippi after that casualty down there. Preparing for mass casualties is really a very difficult situation because there's a lot of resources, a lot of time, a lot of preparation for a maybe, what if, what not. So it's really hard to stay focused. And then once the incident finally occurs, as well as you are prepared, it's still a little bit of a cluster. And that's why we have individuals like Dr. Callaway to help us prepare and organize this. Dr. Callaway is a professor of the Department of Emergency Medicine here, and is obviously the Chief of Operational Disaster Medicine here as well. His history is not just a bunch of titles. He has a number of, for lack of a better term, deployments around the world. For different situations, both military and non-military, for disaster response and disaster preparedness. So we are really blessed having a true expert and help us guide us through the future. Thank you.
I was going to pat him on the shoulder just for the heck of it, just to make everybody happy here. All right, so I'm going to ramble for maybe, I'm going to try to go as fast as I can and confuse you all as much as I can. Because then you'll think that what we do is super complex and only a few people can figure it out, and it'll keep my job. So I want to talk about dynamic mass casualties. And there's about 8 or 9 years ago, we coined this phrase because historically mass casualties were thought of as one single event that happened, the threat ended, and then there were a bunch of casualties. And so you just went about your business and you put them into green, yellow, and red zones. Sometimes you did a blue or black or an orange, depending upon where you were. But the situation changes when the threat is dynamic and ongoing. So this is timely because we're prepping for the RNC, so we're revising a bunch of our policies. The RNC logo apparently looks like some comic book villain. If you Google RNC logo on the internet, you get a bunch of funny descriptions about why we would choose an angry elephant with a monster behind it. So just so everybody knows, the RNC is coming to town. Surprise. August 24th through 27th of next year. School's been delayed a week, so don't worry about it. Uptown's going to be shut down. It's going to probably be a bigger impact than the DNC in terms of what gets closed down. And so hopefully you all start thinking about how that impacts your individual divisions, your workflow and your life, and you consider renting out your house and making a bunch of money. So when we think about this, and we're going to get to triage because this is kind of where we're leading into, but the way we think about impact when we think about large events, we have to think about daily impacts and crisis impacts. So the daily operations you can just think, right? So if they lock down all of Uptown, we have 2,000 employees that live up there. We have a couple of fixed facilities that are up there. So that dramatically impacts how people just get to work, how we see patients, logistics and resupply. If they shut down 277 for certain events, that's a big fat deal, right? That's just routine operations. So imagine if something happens. So we have civil unrest. The media will create drama no matter what. And then what if we actually have mass casualties? And this is what everyone's afraid of, especially given the current environment. So what we're going to talk about quickly is very briefly like triage and why it matters, because everybody kind of knows that. We're all emergency medicine trauma. I'm going to talk about what a dynamic mass casualty is. We're going to talk about why triage sucks. And what we can do about it, and then we're going to talk about the challenges of how you operationalize triage in a dynamic environment. So here's your obligatory historical slide, right? There's Dominique Jean-Leray, Napoleon surgeon, who gets credited with sort of creating triage on the battlefield, became codified during World War I with these casualty collection points and this formalized triage process. And then the fire department basically took it and created what historically has been this very static mass casualty response and triage. So anybody know where this is? If anybody saw this slide, would they be like, yeah, that's a classic triage slide. So this is a classic triage slide. You've got your green tarp, your yellow tarp, and your red tarp. And what do you notice about that? There are probably a lot of things to notice, but what I notice is there are no patients on them. And the reason there are no patients is because this is the LAX shooting from a couple years ago, and all the patients were on the inside of security. Right? So they had an access issue to get to the victims or the casualties or the patients. And so this is all cool and it makes for a great slide, but it was completely operationally irrelevant. So when we're talking about triage, there are a couple of definitions that I'm going to throw out there, and then we'll mix it up to make it more confusing. So most of what people think about when they think about triage is primary triage. So this is point of injury, point of event, so first contact with a victim, and it's where you're doing this sift and sort, and you're trying to figure out who do I prioritize, doing an evaluation and assessment, and then ultimately a treatment and transport. So this is, when people talk about triage systems, they talk about primary triage. And we're going to go over a couple of the current systems just for familiarization. Secondary triage is generally and historically been what happens in the hospital. So medic goes, there's a bus crash, they triage everybody using one of these systems, they put a bunch of tags on them, which we know never happens. They come into the emergency department, and then we perform secondary triage, usually with our colleagues from trauma surgery, to determine, all right, what hospital resources need to be allocated. All right. And usually it happens in the hospital. It can happen in the pre-hospital setting, and we see this mostly in conflict zones because there is this delay of evacuation, and so secondary triage has to go on. And then tertiary triage, this again gets into the point where we're sort of deep into a mass casualty event, and we're starting to look at, what resource commitments do we need to start calling for? Do we need more ICU beds? Do we need to start activating the system? So we're pushing patients from CMC Maine to Northeast or to Pineville. So this is tertiary triage, and there's very little written or talked about on this. So here in theory is this idea of what happens. So you've got a mass cal, so something happens, you have your primary triage immediately, and then somewhere is a secondary triage in between the treatment area. Okay? And then you start to figure out where you're going to transport people and evacuate them, and you have to coordinate all of these assets. All right. So that's great. That assumes that there is one event, it's done, and there's no ongoing threat. But we know that that's not what causes mass casualties now. That's not what we see in the last decade of mass casualties. So whether it's the Madrid bombing, the Aurora shooting, whether it's bombings in Turkey or whether it's bombings in Boston, we have these dynamic events. And they're described as an ongoing threat to victims, civilians, bystanders, responders. At the time of response, right? You need to be able to assess them, and so you need to have a method for assessing them. You need to stabilize them, and then you need to evacuate them. And in the pre-hospital setting, it's evacuate. But even if you come into the trauma bay, it's the same deal. Trauma code 1, what's the biggest problem with accessing the casualty in trauma code 1? The 50 people in the room, or an OB or a PEDS trauma, right? There are 50 people in room 1. So just even like getting to the casualty, like it's an access issue. So whether it's a fire, whether it's an active shooter, or whether it's just something blocking you, access is an issue. And so this is a framework that we use to teach this, because again, it doesn't matter if you're in the pre-hospital setting or the hospital, you always have to access casualty, you have to assess and stabilize them, and then you have to move them. And so again, moving out of the trauma bay, the evacuate is either to the OR, the ICU, the floor, or home. All right, so the paradigm is the same. All right, so let's talk a little bit about primary triage and why it changes in these situations. So we talked about it as the initial point of interaction with casualty. So you have to have a mentality shift when you're talking about dynamic environments. You still want survival for the greatest number of casualties or patients in triage. But when you look at how you are going to do your assessment and stabilization, and you're trying to balance resources and demands, the situation dictates this, right? So it's not like I'm rolling up and I've got all the resources and I just have resources in one hand, demand in the other, and then I can just mesh them together. There's something else that's going to affect that. And the end point, again, is always movement or evacuation. So what are generally accepted over and under triage rates, right? The whole point is we're trying to maximize what we do for people, not miss stuff. So what's a generally accepted under triage rate? What do you guys think? There are all kinds of wrong answers, so feel free to throw them out. Okay, 10%, right? Where's the 10% come from? It's made up. What's an under triage 10%, over triage 50%, right? So we want to be sensitive. We don't want to miss anything. But we understand that if we over triage at 50%, we're going to have a resource burden put on our hospitals. So when we think about planning, we need to acknowledge that aspect of it. So primary triage tools. This is like, you know, when you get into something that's super down in the weeds, everyone has very strong opinions about it, and they're usually just like echo chambers that because someone put a flag in the ground somewhere. So they all have the basic same components, right? There's red, which need to be treated probably within 30 minutes. Life-saving interventions need to be done immediately. So airway problems, hemorrhagic shock, unstable vital signs. Most places will throw burn in there. I don't know burn, you know, take it or leave it. But mainly it's people that need immediate interventions. So yellow and or orange, and the reason this has got two slices is because historically MCI is focused on trauma. But what we realize is that an MCI creates a bunch of medical problems too. So if you're in Boston and you're 65 and you got heart disease and you're watching your daughter run the Boston Marathon and a bomb goes off and you start having chest pain and someone comes up and is like, hey, old man, you're fine. You don't have any holes in your chest. And you're like, yeah, but it's going to my neck and I can't breathe and I'm nauseated, right? Like you can still have an MI. And so a STEMI still counts as a significant medical problem, even in an MCI. So some classifications will have that as this orange category, which is, you know, medical instability. But you can see it's the same basic deal. It needs to be taken care of usually within 30 minutes to a couple hours, and it's a general gestalt on it. And then green, which I call the death zone, and then deceased or expectant. These matter because if you think about what you're going to put into the gray or black zone, it's different if you're on scene and you've got 2 ambulances and you're looking at 40 people and you're saying, who do I need to get to the hospital? That's different than if you're in our ambulance bay and you have the exact same people and you say, all right, what resources do I have to match up against these people? So someone who just lost their pulses from getting shot in the chest, it's probably a gray or black if you're on scene 10 minutes from us. If you're a drop-off in our ambulance bay, you're not. And you have to think about that because what happens is people try to apply pre-hospital triage paradigms to the hospital. And so you run into problems when you do that. All right, so here's START. I'm just going to show you guys this because this is what Medic uses. So everyone heard of START triage, created by firefighters, and they want it to be really simple. So if you can walk, you're green. Then you go get secondary triage. So what's the problem with that? If I shoot you in the chest, can you probably walk? Probably, right? So, hey man, if you can walk, go over there. We'll get to you in a little bit. Sorry that you got shot, or sorry that a bomb went off and you have a bunch of little microfrags in your belly and in your chest. All right, but anyways, you got to have something, right? So if you can walk, you're green. You're going to be assessed later. Look at respirations. Are you breathing spontaneously? No. Then you're expectant. Yes. You're immediate. So it's just basically RPM. So it's respirations greater than 30 or less than 10. It's a cap refill of less than 2, and then can you follow simple commands? So that's just a basic field triage, and there's a pediatric jump start, which basically follows the same algorithm except for In the respiration side, it says readjust and give 5 rescue breaths because peds have a higher rate of respiratory issues causing arrest. All right. So as I talked about, so here are the challenges, especially in dynamic MCIs. So I can still walk when I'm shot in the chest or shot in the belly, but those are going to be probably ATC1s based on our current system, right? If I have blast lung or blast frag, or if I'm having a heart attack, I can still walk, all right? But am I sick? Am I red, technically? Yes. So you need to be very, this is why I'll emphasize this a bunch of times, in this type of event, you need to think about the greens as a death zone, all right? Smart triage. So smart triage is a variation of START, and it gets even better because smart triage actually has smart triage cards. And Medic uses START triage, but smart triage cards. Tracking? Pretty awesome, right? So the only real difference here is that you actually start having an intervention. So you still get to the respirations, you get to capillary refill, but if there's bleeding, that hurt, you're grounded. She doesn't care. I'm just kidding. You don't even know what grounding means. But you get your first intervention, right? So bleeding control. And this is hemorrhage that can be controlled easily and quickly, so mostly extremity bleeding. Because, again, we know that if you're shot or you have a transected femoral artery and you're spraying blood all over the place, you're a red, right? But if I put a tourniquet on your isolated femoral artery wound and I stop the bleeding, you may not be a red anymore. All right, so you're still a priority, but that's why controlling the hemorrhage, it's a very fast intervention, and you start to see where we're moving towards not just assessments, but quick interventions while you're doing the assessment. All right. I just put this up here because I like the zombie category. But again, when we're trying to do this, part of this is scene control and crowd control, and then understanding that you need to put this in place in terms of access, assessment, stabilization, and evacuation. So they can assess these people all day long, and where are they going to go? Well, there's a crowd on the other side of the ambulance that's just the same. So now they're blocking your evacuation. So as you put this in place, you have to think about the operational context. So when you look at START or SMART or all these other systems, the challenge when you look at it across the U.S. is there's huge variability. So NASEMSO is the National Association of State EMS officers or officials. And basically they did a survey. They found that START's the most commonly utilized, but that up to almost 40% of states don't have a mass casualty protocol that integrates one of these standardized triage tools. So this is back in 2008 and 2011. This helped lead to this idea of creating this model uniform criteria, the MUC, and this was funded and supported by ASPR and HHS, so ASPR is the Assistant Secretary of Preparedness and Response, and they basically looked at all the systems and they said, all right, what do we think a triage system should have? Which existing systems have them, which don't? And then how do we combine the best from each system? And you don't need to know all this stuff, but basically they did a little matrix here, and they came up with this new system, which is endorsed by DHS and CDC for mass casualty triage, but is probably only implemented in about 30% of EMS agencies across the country. So it makes sense, though. I think this idea makes sense. So the first step, 2 parts. There's the sorting, and then there's the assessment, right? So the first thing you're doing is you're saying, hey, anyone who can walk or move, go over there. And you're not saying that they're not injured. You're just saying, we're going to get to you third, right? And if you see people moving, waving their hands, okay, they're with you. And if you see people who are still and have an obvious life threat, they're who you're going to go to first. So it's just a very easy way of laying out who are you going to respond to first when you roll up on the scene and you have no idea what's going on. And then this is the part that I like. So the assessment becomes an individual assessment. So you do these simple life-saving interventions while you're doing your assessment. So if they're bleeding from an extremity, you throw a tourniquet on. If it's an airway issue and you just do a jaw thrust. If it's a kid, you get rescue breaths. If you're worried about penetrating chest trauma or tension pneumothorax, you needle the chest. And then they have the auto-injector antidotes for like ChemBio stuff. But you do these first and fast, and then you look at, are they breathing or not? So if you've needled the chest, they're unresponsive. So it is an unresponsive person, right? So unresponsive, you go up, they're not breathing, you've needled the chest, and they're still not breathing, they're probably dead, right? If they are breathing, then you start looking at, do they have any hemorrhage? Do they have a pulse? And then respiratory distress. And then this can create, this brings you down to these different categories. Sorry, slides are mixed up. So if you're breathing, yep, you obey commands, you have peripheral pulse, only minor injuries, you're minimal. All right, if you're breathing, You obey commands. Any of those are no. So either commands, pulse, respiratory distress, no, then you go over into this immediate. All right. And what this does is it allows you to get into this phase where it's assessment and stopping life-threatening hemorrhage, tension in thoraces, and airway. Why these three things? And these three things are picked out because if you look at combat data, these are the number 1, 2, and 3 causes of potentially preventable death and trauma. They also can be done in less than 30 seconds. I can put on a tourniquet, needle a chest, and flip someone on their side in under a minute. And I can do each one of those interventions in under 30 seconds. So that's pretty quick. And you can do it concurrently while you're doing an assessment on whether you think that they should be ready for real. All right, so I talked about how everyone loves their system. I like to actually just relate this to religion, right? Because there are people who start assuming everything you can do and assault, and you'll listen to people argue for hours on it, and you're like, seriously, it doesn't matter. And the answer is probably not. There's not really any great data on any one of them being better. Here, just a sample of the study is looking at accuracy. Now, the notes part of it is important because you look over and you're like, accuracy, 80%, cool, 70%, 93%, 91%, that's awesome. They're judging accuracy based on fake scenarios that were created by people who know the system, and they say, all right, if you use the system, do you match this fake scenario the way that I think you should? And some of them do virtual reality, so it's even cooler, and they're like, yep, you got it, man, you nailed it with this amount of accuracy. Super, and then here's your over and under triage rates. The problem is, there's only been one study that looked at any of this applied in a real situation, and this was a Philadelphia train crash. And they found 48% accuracy, about 50% over triage, which we talked about, it's okay, 2% under triage, but no time on how long it took to do it. So the point that most people will make when they talk about this is no one is better than the other. You just need to have a system, and you need to acknowledge that there are limitations to each system, and you need to work around figuring out how to address those. So if you pick a system and you're like, they're all the same, that's fine, I'm going to pick X, you need to be able to train it and sustain it. All of these systems, whether you start, smart, or SALT, can be learned, they can be sustained. They've all been shown that if you take paramedics or nurses or ED docs, I don't know of any trauma surgeon specific tests. There probably have been a cohort on this, but basically they all can be trained, right? They're just simple algorithms. So if you give people a presentation on here are the rules, and then you give them scenarios and so they can put them in place, and then you test them on them, they both can learn them and retain them. All right, so primary triage, those are the systems that exist. Let's get back to dynamic MCIs. So how do you put this in place in dynamic MCI? So does anybody know anything about the Aurora shooting or much about the Aurora shooting? Right, so dude goes in, puts a bunch of bombs in his apartment, goes in and starts shooting people up. And as people came out of the theater, what happened? You guys know? No bombs didn't go off. Good thought, though. So remember what we talked about. So we're going to talk about access, assess, stabilize, and evacuate. So EMS responds, fire responds, law enforcement responds. Who gets there first? Who always gets there first? Who always gets there first? Cops. So cops get there first, right? So cops get there, shots fired. Cops are there within a couple minutes, right? And they're all around the theater. And as they're around, so theater, cops, people flooding out, right? So they flood past the cops, except for the ones that can't. So the ones that can flood past the cops, and they start filling the parking lot with people and cars. And so fire gets stuck, right? So fire can't get anywhere near their designated casualty collection points or their triage points. So fire is out there. People are running all over. They don't know if there's bad guy or no bad guy, right? So they're trying to figure out how do you actually do triage. So normally, where do people do triage? In a high threat zone or a low threat zone? Low threat zone, right? Again, this is like super dumb big animal guy stuff. This is why I do it. So they do it in a low threat zone because if you're going to bring all your resources in and you're going to sit there and you're going to look down at a patient and not understand what's going around you, like you want to be in a safe zone. Okay, so where's the safe zone? London bombing. It blew up the subway. People came out of the subway. London fire started to respond and they blew up a double-decker bus. Where is the safe zone? There isn't one. But if you look at all of these paradigms for response, it says hot zone, warm zone, cold zone. There is no cold zone in these events, right? Orlando, where is Melissa here? Orlando, right? Like in theory, the hospital is the cold zone, except when it's 2 blocks away from a shooting and there are a bunch of people flooding in uncontrolled, and you have no idea if the shooter is one of them or if they're going to target the hospital as well. Because if you want to knock something out, knock out the people who are going to respond. All right. So access becomes an issue. So on scene, the threat determines how we're going to access people, how we're going to do triage. It's important to understand that there's no cold zone. And this is now a paradigm within EMS, and it affects us because if there's no cold zone, that means people are going to be moving faster from point of injury to getting to us. All right, so access issues as well. Do you have discrete or multi-site incidents, right? Mumbai, 3 days, a bunch of 7 different places, 8 different places, roaming teams shooting people, right? The Boston bombing, there are 2 bombs that go off that are separated, and then there's roaming street fights, gunfights with the brothers. Dispersion across time and space. Most events that happen now are not a single finite event. It's not Timothy McVeigh blowing up the Oklahoma City bombing, and there's one event and it's terrible, but that was it. That's not what happens these days. And then understanding the site-specific limitations. Then there's what we do, right? So there's all this stuff that's organic to the event. Then there's what we do. So what happens if there's an active shooter in Charlotte? Anywhere. We'll just use Charlotte because we're here. What do you think happens? Shooting at South Park Mall. There's a man with a gun shooting people at South Park Mall. So that goes over the radio, and what happens? Every cop in the region, marshals, CMPD, Huntersville, Pineville, everybody converges on this. CFD responds with their RTF, their Rescue Task Force, and their tactical units. Medics responding, right? So this is DC, and they got a bunch of heat for this because no one could get anywhere. This is Navy Yard shooting, but everyone converges on this. What happens if there's a shooting at CMC? Same deal, right? What happens if there's a cop that gets shot that gets brought into CMC? Right? Like you guys have all seen this. They come burning through, and that's an issue because we need to figure out how to address that. So this affects how we access our casualties and do our triage. And what about the victims when they can't move? How do you do that? What about when all they want to do is run? So if someone's shot in the chest and there's ongoing shooting, adrenaline can help them run a really long way, right? And again, Orlando is a great example of this. Aurora is a great example of this. The Harvest Route 91 shooting is an example of this. People got away, right? So they're sick and now they're all over the place. All right, so we talked a little bit about this. The big lesson that came out of Aurora had to do with law enforcement. So 75% of the casualties transported in the first 30 minutes out of Aurora were transported by cops. And when Denver in general, and when the hospitals went back and looked at the mortality was the same, right? Philadelphia has looked at this as an intentional strategy. So if you get shot in the belly in Philadelphia and a cop gets there, they just put you in the back of the cop car and they drive you to the trauma center. And why is that? It's because you need a trauma surgeon. Like you may kind of need me just to like give you blood and stabilize you, but like you need a trauma surgeon, right? And so there's nothing in the pre-hospital environment that's going to do anything different. And so if I can shrink your time from injury to cold steel, and I used to have a picture of Ron saying with cold steel. If I can shrink that time by 10 minutes, I'm going to save your life. I'm going to save more lives. So this is important because who's getting triage? Are they doing any triage? Nah, man, they're just taking the event and bringing it right to us. And we saw this again. Orlando's a classic case where they just started loading people up and bringing them to the trauma center. All right, let's get this. So this is in the AAR from the after action report from Boston. So Boston EMS is one of the best EMS systems in the country, and they'll tell you that. And they use STAR triage. But this is their direct quote. There are bombs that blew up. Everyone started rolling into the casualty collection point, the CCP. We did not do triage in the CCP. They basically, and this was the doctor who wrote this is a Army doctor who's back on active duty now. But he basically just fell back into this trauma czar practice where he was sitting there trying to like just tell people how to do stabilization as they were flooding into them. And the advantage that they had was they had 30 or 40 ambulances sitting right there, and they had 5 trauma centers within a mile and a half. So they just like flooded people in, and then they did call-ins to the different trauma centers. And their big win, besides preparedness, was their CMed, their med control, took great ownership immediately and started distributing these patients. So they got them in the ambulance, and sometimes the ambulances didn't have a destination as they started to drive. They'd call in and they would get told where they're going. Now, again, that's great if you have 5 trauma centers. For us, like, they're going to come to us until we start offloading somewhere else. So we need to be ready to do primary and secondary triage in the ED. So this was their recommendations. They would have wanted to create sweep teams, so sweep triage teams that can go through and assess and tag people quickly. This idea that there's only one triage officer is dangerous, right? Because I would say if you move away from just an assessment paradigm to one where you're doing assessment and life-saving interventions like tourniquet and needle decompressions, you want to flex your resources forward, right? So you want to have 3 or 4 triage teams that can go and not become the roadblock. Because if you have just one person, like, that's the bottleneck right there. So you want to push your resources forward. You want to rapidly triage. You want to do life-saving interventions as quickly as possible. And then you want to see who really is a red, who really needs our high-value resources like trauma surgery or the trauma bay. And then just in terms of documentation, so ASPR held a 40-person roundtable of leading experts, and they just talked about a bunch of issues, but which we'll hit at in a sec. But one of them had to do is like triage tags. And they looked back at most MCIs and they realized that almost never were triage tags used. We still train them, but they're just never used, and part of it's because people are moving pretty fast. And usually we also have transportation assets, so people are saying, you're a red, putting you on an ambulance. And they're not taking time to fill out the cards, and even if we train it, it's not happening. So that matters for us, again, when we start thinking about how we are going to respond to a dynamic mass casualty. We're going to have medic doing quick assessments and probably rapidly pushing people. We're going to have people rapidly fleeing the scene and showing up. And so we need to mix primary, secondary, and tertiary triage all at our front door. All right, so then assessment stabilization challenges. So who does this? We talked about this, but having multiple triage officers and sweep teams, again, the old paradigm was put the dentist out front as the triage officer. People have been around for a while, you remember this? It's like they have just enough knowledge to follow the algorithm, but not enough knowledge to like get down in the weeds and start doing stuff. I think that's changed. You want to have someone who's super knowledgeable about your resources and what current resuscitation standards are in order to help you determine how you're going to use your resources. And then where does this happen? So the way that we've redefined threat zones is there's a direct threat zone, which is the area where the threat to your life as a responder and the ongoing threat to the casualty is higher than whatever the injury is. There's the indirect threat zone, which is everything else, right? So this is where there's still a threat. You still need to be aware, but you can allocate a few more resources. So in general, this is where the assessment and stabilization triage should go on in this warm zone, indirect threat zone. And for us, it will probably be in the ambulance bay, and we need to control that space. And then how to do it. So we're looking at this right now. We've got a great team that's trying to figure out how we're going to do this, but a lot of things we're talking about is one team versus multiple teams. Which triage tool are we going to use? Are we going to use the same one that medic uses, or are we going to modify it? And again, the key thing that this ASPR working group talked about, which I think a lot of us have had issues with, is if you're shot in the chest or you're shot in the belly, you can still be a green by all those other triage systems. And that's one thing if you're on scene. It's a different thing if you're in our ambulance bay, because your time from going from being okay to being dead could be 5 minutes, could be 3 minutes, right? Like, we've seen this so many times in our daily practice where someone comes in, they had pulses in the ambulance, right? And they roll them on the trauma bay, the trauma bed, and their pulses. So whatever system needs to add this penetrating trauma to the torso into how we do this. And then the big green monster, this slide is from back in my Boston days, obviously, but it is a monster, right? So the problem with the greens and where we put them and how we reassess them is that most people are going to be greens, right? And buried in there are these really sick time bombs that we need to get to quickly. And this initial sorting of them into the green is fine and appropriate, but when we allocate resources, having a separate triage sweep team that goes into this green area and quickly re-evaluates all the patients to determine, okay, are you really a green, or by vital signs or mechanism, are you actually a red? We know from multiple after actions that the green zone security becomes an issue, communication is an issue. You have so many people, so crowd control becomes an issue. psychological issues, mitigation. So, all you need is that one person who's yelling and screaming and freaking out to completely take your 20 or 30 people who are relatively calm and listening and turn them into a mob that disrupts your operations. You can imagine trying to implement this here, right? So you've got someone in the ambulance bay, and we're green, 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 green. We put them in areas. All of a sudden, someone's like, hey, that person's really sick. And you start getting a bunch of anxiety. You start getting a bunch of bad energy that completely disrupts your operation. So aggressively going after the greens are important. All right. So a couple things just on update on warm zone operations. And again, relevance to us because if an event like this happens, we're going to see significantly more interventions happen. The rescue task force concept is put in place in Charlotte. It began in Virginia, and it's this idea of pairing law enforcement and ALS providers in a team that go in and do basic life-saving interventions in this high-threat area before bringing them out to be evacuated. This is what we do here. You guys should just generally be familiar with it. Fire and CMPD do the rescue task force model in Charlotte. And again, they'll evacuate and stabilize, and then they take the medic, and medic does their primary triage because only medic can do triage. And for those of you online, you can't see my scare quotes, which is awesome. But really, like they're triaging, right? They're determining, fire and CMPD are going, they're triaging people to bring them out, but official triage doesn't happen until they get out to medic. The medic triages them and brings them back to us. Okay. We talked about the cold zone. So this is from this working group from ASPR. You don't need to know it, except the reason I put this up here is because finally, as of end of 2018, early 2019, they basically said, hey, look, there's a difference between static MCIs and dynamic MCIs. And what this lays out is some guidelines for addressing the threat component of how you do assessments of patients, understanding that the external threat affects the triage tool that you use. And it's important because it gives people a lot of options. You don't have to say, if you got someone sick and you've got an ongoing threat, you don't need to stay on scene. You don't need to waste time doing assessments. Get the person out of there. But that has consequences. So get them out of there is great, but it means we start seeing a larger number of undifferentiated trauma patients at our front door. And it's not just trauma patients, it's all the baggage that comes with this dynamic situation. We talked about this, but it is the security, it is the screening of people, it is crowd control, it is all of those together. It's the fact that at some point, someone is going to threaten a trauma center after one of these events. We know that a lot of these events have multiple components to it. At some point, someone's going to target a trauma center. So that needs to be thought about when we're doing this kind of response. And this data that EMS and disaster sciences, it's like pseudo seizures. I'm not sure if it exists really. But this is the old historic data that led to all this, which is, right, so here's how you plan for an MCI in a hospital. So in your first hour, you're going to get this big wave of people, and most of them are going to be 4s and 5s and minor because they're going to self-present. The EMS, while that's going on, is going to be on scene, and they're going to be doing a real triage, and then they'll get you the red one, so you'll get some reds as well. But most of it's going to be in the first hour, and most of it's not going to be really sick. Orlando, Vegas, Aurora, Boston. That's not what happened. That's not what happens anymore. And so when you go back and look at this, you can't use this for a planning document. You need to be able to turn it on immediately. From minute one of an event, you need to be able to handle this high influx of penetrating trauma and complex trauma. 80% in Vegas. 80% of patients seen self-presented. 80%. All right, so here's the document I was talking about. It lays out a couple cool things. One is it does integrate this paradigm that we've worked on for years. And I just want to talk about it. Like, it still applies in the hospital. We hinted on this a little bit earlier, but so access assessment, stabilization, evacuation. So if we think about this framework, then it allows us to think of what the barriers are that are blocking us from accessing, assessing, stabilizing, and moving our patients. That helps us then allocate resources and mitigate these risks. So the assessment piece, just to hit on this here quick in the hospital, there's no validated pre-hospital primary triage system that shows that it improves mortality. There's no even studied system that looks at hospital-based triage, okay, for a mass casualty incident. So this becomes expert opinion and expert consensus, of which a lot of people in this room are weighing in. And the good news is we can sort of say, hey, this is what makes sense and put it in place. And the good news also is that the Assistant Secretary of Preparedness and Response is on record saying, if you take trauma surgeons and emergency medicine doctors and you give them a mass casualty and they just take their clinical judgment, it's better than any existing primary triage system. So that helps us. It's kind of a pain in the butt because it'd be nice to be able to just pull a system and say, hey, this is a system that works, let's just train it and integrate it into our system. All right. So triage dynamic MCI is complex. We need to access them to triage them. We're always going to have to assume more risk as we look at these events compared to prior MCIs. Whatever the system, they're all the same. We need to train, and again, we need to identify the system so we can train it, and then we need to train it for real. The green monster is a real deal. And then our policies in general need to mirror or build up daily practices wherever is possible. And this is kind of best practice across disaster response and MCI response. The moment you start creating new systems and totally different ways of responding, the harder it is to train it, the harder it is to sustain it, and the more complexity you put into the system. And especially for the emergency department, if you think about the number or the amount of turnover we have in like techs and nurses, you can imagine the training requirement that creates to try to make sure everyone's up on this new system. It's already a huge training burden just to get them into our current system. So what we want to do is maximize our current system as best we can and then scale it where necessary. That's all I've got. You rock, young lady. I love you. Any questions? Or comments, or...
A lot of questions out there.
That's an easy question, Dr. Ross. Dr. Ross asked, what do we have in place for responding to a targeted attack on the healthcare system? Probably talk about it offline, and also probably talk about the fact that it needs to be more robust. But it's an issue that's thought about and talked about, and generally the way you approach the problem, the way generally we approach the problem, is how we utilize system assets and how we move between our facility and prioritized other facilities within the metro area to be able to utilize their assets. Mostly things like OR, blood products become the biggest issue, and then obviously the process for movement. And just on the movement side, generally, I would say the thing that we are looking at is how do you scale our existing system for moving patients between facilities, which we already have in place as part of the surge plan. So how do you reallocate resources to that so that instead of moving one patient every 2 hours by med center at emergency, we're able to move 8 patients or 10 patients. And Medic has some unique assets that allow us to do that if there is an event like that.
I have a couple questions, and we got 15 minutes. So a couple things that we've learned with some of our experiences here as well is one of the things about preparing for mass casualty events is frequently there's a lot of tabletop issues that go along, a lot of mental thinking about what the strategies are, et cetera. And a number of years ago, we had a regional disaster practice session where we had a train derailment with chemical exposure, and we had a very detailed disaster session where we actually had patients show up at different institutions, went through the actual decontamination process, et cetera. And some of the things we learned is that some of the things we thought were ready weren't ready. And some of the things that we thought were appropriate. So one of the decontaminations actually contaminated the front of the emergency, would have contaminated the emergency department, which therefore would have shut down that emergency department. Same thing happened here. Our decontamination room leaked into the ED major, which would have shut us down, which would have been a catastrophe for the response. So how do we go about preparing with the actual practice sessions to actually see how this stuff really works? Because you have to really turn this equipment on once in a while to see if it actually does turn on.
Yeah. So the question is, how do we train and prepare? Which is always a great question. The things to consider when looking at the solution, one is update and standardize plans and procedures. Then two is allocation of resources to be able to train and sustain. There's a JCO requirement for just judge it as you will. There's a JCO requirement to run a certain number of drills, both on decontamination, mass casualty response annually. What we're in the process of doing right now, and we're leveraging the RNC to be able to do this, is revising the mass casualty policy, creating a more robust training program for this, including micro drills and tabletops, and then trying to use exercises more as validation rather than learning opportunities, because everyone who's been involved in one of these large-scale mass casualty drills realizes that there's a bunch of chaos, and then people get a bunch of feedback, and then it's unclear what really happens to it. So building out a robust training plan that addresses both mass casualty, then also decon. That's what emergency management is working on right now, with the goal of having that plan in place by sort of mid-November, laying out what will happen over the next year. Again, it's the issue. Some of the issues that arise are, how do you deconflict training with real patient care? Again, for example, we've run multiple drills, so mass casualty drills in the emergency department. And one of the first steps that is supposed to happen in real life is that nurses from the floor come down and pull patients up to the ward to decompress the emergency department. So we can do that with inflatable dummies, but it's sort of fake and no one really does it. We can do that with real patients, but then that drill actually impacts potentially real patient care. And whether it actually has a negative impact on patient care or not, I think is debatable, but it impacts patient care and it impacts staffing patterns. And so when you look at it from an administrative standpoint, allocating resources, money, and staff time to this against all the other priorities that the leaders in this room have, that's the argument that we have to make. And so in our particular case now, the RNC is what's allowing us to make that case more effectively about why we need to train more and why we need to train more effectively.
Dr. Evans?
Yep. Yeah, no. So the question is basically, how do we more effectively message and train what needs to be done? It's a great question. We've asked to have an education training working group put together within emergency management to address this issue, because it needs to be done better. And I'll tell you my general framework for kind of how I posed it to the group. So one is, there needs to be accessible, sustainable training online. And so people can just go and look at it and they can learn it. There needs to be a requirement to do the training so people have done it. And then within the high-risk departments, so trauma, surgery, emergency medicine, we need additional training that's very specific and focused to our groups. And then there needs to be just-in-time training, which, Dr. Evans, is kind of what you were referring to, which is, how do I get the information? An event's happened. How do I get the information that is immediately what I need to do and what actions I need to take in the first 1 minute to, call it 15 minutes. Technology can be super helpful for that. Good thing we've got a fellow in the disaster medicine department who loves doing technology stuff. So I think it's probably a good thing to put him on. the key though again is just getting agreement on what our new policy is going to be.
Mass gatherings like the NASCAR races, face game, how does Event 1 and AMAC roll into the equation?
So the question was, how do we apply all of our extensive resources that we have in the system to deal with mass gathering events? So distinctly different events: Panthers, NASCAR, RNC. So the standard processes in place for Panthers, NASCAR, we have, event medicine kind of staffs at. Local EMS has MCI plans in place for how they respond if there were an event. And that's just kind of day-to-day MCI stuff. I would argue that probably we need to think about the dynamic piece of it too, because likely it would be that type of event. And then the RNC is a little different in terms of allocation of resources. So in those other routine events where we have contracts to provide care, we don't mobilize Med 1, we don't mobilize in general. So we have variable mobilization of the SMAT, the State Medical Assistance Team, but we have sort of a steady state of support for those events. With the RNC, the security issues change, the risk changes, and it's probably less of a risk in terms of the likelihood of event as opposed to the consequence if there is an event. And so the risk management piece of it is pretty structured and routine. The Secret Service has a whole policy for, they do this a couple times a year. So we just plug in and there's a risk matrix and we put our resources there. The consequence piece of it is where it becomes a big deal, because again, if just routine care. So if a drunk person at the Panthers game falls down the steps and hits their head, and there's a 10-minute EMS response, and they get to us and we take care of them, and it's good care, that's fine. If a drunk delegate or the Secretary of State falls down the stairs and someone's not there in 2 minutes, then all of a sudden CNN and Fox News and everyone's there, right? So the consequences of an event become much more dramatic in something like this NSSE. And so as a consequence, we allocate way more resources to it in an effort to mitigate that potential negative consequence. Does that make sense? And so that's why like Med 1 will be there, even though in the DNC Med 1 saw, I don't know, 180 people. And even though in the DNC, we actually saw decreased volumes in our EDs across the system, we'll have redundant staffing and we'll have backup staffing. And it's all because on the off chance that something bad happens, the consequences are so dramatic. Dr. Lauer.
Sensitivity, say, our current triage system with the need for more kind of flags, whether one of this is on positive predictive value in your triage system, given the fact that there will be limited resources.
I was under the impression there'd be no math or science in this presentation. So I think the question is, how do we get better at triage? Yeah. Yep. Yeah. So how do you shift from? So one of the statements I made earlier was, as much as possible, you want to build on existing systems and then scale existing systems if you can. And so the question that Dr. Lauer is bringing up, which is one of the fundamental questions, is, so when do you switch? So when does scaling the existing system when do you overwhelm when does the crisis overwhelm the ability to scale your existing system? And to be honest with you, I don't know the answer to it. I think that the way that we've addressed this, and Dr. Lauer is working on this process with us, is I approach everything with a PACE methodology, so primary, alternate, contingency, and emergency, and the way we think about how we're going to do communications. It's the way we think about where we're going to put patients. It's the way we think about who's going to do a process, right? There's a primary, and then primary, for whatever reason, doesn't work. There's an alternate, contingency, and emergency, and it allows the person who's in the situation to be able to have a range of options without necessarily hardwired algorithmic decisions on when you shift from primary to alternate, because it's impossible to program out everything that could happen in these events. And so we try to approach it that way. And so we try to take the people who are experts in daily operations, and we say, what makes sense first? If that didn't work, what would make sense next? And then we try to put these in place. And then the key that is then to go and train and evaluate them with these drills and see if our assumptions break down. And so again, I think, because you and I have had this conversation before, the question comes back to this person, for example, gets shot in the chest and loses their pulses in our trauma bay or in our ambulance bay. If you start triage, they're black, you just stop. But what if they're the first patient, or what if the rest of the patients that come in are actually 20 yellows, right? And this was actually the only person who really needed a surgical intervention, and they're already there at your doorstep, right? It's not like you're allocating a resource, an ambulance and a rig to transport them, when that ambulance and the rig could be doing assessments on 50 other people. They're here, they're where they need to be. So how do you address it? And it's a hard question. I don't know the answer to it. And I don't know how you improve positive predictive value of triage, except for the fact that most people now think that based on the experience of the providers in the room, we can tell who's sick or not. And in general, we can tell who's going to need a surgical intervention or not when they're in the sick side, right? Not the middle ones. If we're sitting there, if Dave Pearson and I are sitting there going, I don't know, maybe they're going to need to go there, I'm not sure, right? That's category. But there are people that even we can be like, they need Lauer, Jacobs, or Singh right now, right? Like I don't need vital signs. Like they need to go with them. And so, how do you blend Gestalt and science? And I think that's what you and I are struggling with as we craft this new policy.
I think some of that would be related to obviously having communication, constant communication, as to how the situation is evolving. So if you truly know that, okay, we've got 30 more patients coming, you know that some of them are going to be on the higher acuity side, at some point somebody's got to tell the first one in the operator, you give one massive transfusion pack and then you're done. You can't use 3 on this first patient. We'll run out. So that goes back to communication, which is always an issue in these settings. And that's going to be my last question.
Yeah, I think that this is where we shift to secondary triage, though, just to hit on this a little bit. My general view is when people are showing up at our door, we're pushing all our assets there, and then that's a finite amount of resources that we're investing in initial stabilization, and then that will determine who starts filtering out of that and starts requiring more resources like the OR or multiple MTPs. My general view is that we should flex everybody. We've got enough providers in the ED, and if we empty the ED effectively enough, we have enough room to be able to take a bunch of really sick people and in the first 10 or 15 minutes do life-saving interventions, and then make the decision at that point, okay, we've got 5 pulseless people or whatever, like our OR assets and our ability to support OR assets do not match up with the volume we're seeing. And that again, I think shifts into the secondary triage piece, which is, again, it's great because there's no science to it. And so it allows us to do what we all think is probably most effective.
Any questions? Thank you.
Any questions?